You all know Les Orsi, a Jesuit now working at Georgetown University, teaching at the Law Center. He's been here a number of times. He's a favorite among Holy Trinity parishioners, and we're delighted to have him to speak on a topic which is very much in the news these days, which the bishops themselves are considering. So it'll be good to hear Father Orsi's take on this particular topic. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mark. Well, thank you very much for coming. And somewhat unusually, I shall follow a different procedure. You see the question, and in fact I put there two questions. Just look at the page that was distributed. May a divorced and remarried person, obviously in the Catholic Church, receive Holy Communion? And then, may a Catholic parish, that means a Catholic community, receive, incorporate a divorced and remarried person into their own Eucharistic community? Now, by putting these two questions, I want to convey right from the beginning that there are two issues there. It's not simply an individual person walking up and receiving communion, but the community itself, that is a community, a communion as they say it, in the Eucharist, want to receive and help that person within their own unit, which could be parish, could be diocese, whatever. So the issue is, may a person receive it, may the community receive him or her. It's mutual. That means also, if there is any change in the law, it ought to be changed on both sides. And therefore, if such persons receive Holy Communion, then the community must be prepared to receive them well and make them really part of their own community. The question is not simple, and today is disputed. For this reason, I thought it will be helpful if before I give my talk at some length, I give you this outline. Not only that, but I would like to take you through this outline and give you an idea as to what the content of my talk is and how I work my way towards a resolution of the issue. If I may give a comparison, this is something like if I have a visitor here in Washington, D.C., a way of introducing him or her into the city, to take him into Arlington Cemetery and take him up to the hill and look down on the city. And he will have an overall view. This is what we have. And now I shall take you to the city, we go to the mall, we go to the museum. And then, in his mind, he has something which is like a map. When he sees a building, he has an idea what the meaning of that building is in context, how it contributes to the beauty of the city. And that's something similar that I am trying to do here. So before giving the formal talk, it will be a bit informal. But nonetheless, I want to take you through it, and you will see what kind of arguments I'm building up, what kind of conclusion I am coming to. It will be much easier to understand the small details, but out of those small details, the whole is built up. So my introduction will be really an overview of the content of the talk. Now please take this page and you see the question there. But then we have conflicting responses. What is interesting, these conflicting responses come from the very highest level. On the one hand, we have Cardinal Müller, who is the prefect of the Congregation for Doctrine, very high position, in some way the second position after the Pope, and he is against admitting such persons to Holy Communion, saying that it is against the indissolubility of marriage. On the other hand, we have Cardinal Casper, who is responding with a resounding yes, they should be admitted. And he proposes a rather complex argument which shows that indissolubility can be honored, and at the same time, the mercy of God can be expanded. Also, to facilitate the understanding of the arguments, I shall work through a hypothetical case, and I shall speak about a marriage between Nancy and Henry. Now, if there are any Nancys or Henrys here, I apologize beforehand. I did not mean that. But you would not believe, I struggled quite a bit about how to find the right names. And I tried with everything. I tried with Greek names and with Latin names, and somehow they did not work. But when we hear about Nancy and Henry, well, we know them, and we know who they are. So I shall take a hypothetical case, and also because if we find a resolution for a somewhat ideal, abstract, hypothetical case, then we can apply what we found for the resolution of this case to other similar cases. That is, we can expand. Now, how shall I search for a resolution of the case? Well, I shall be doing the obvious. We are a church of tradition. The Christian church lives in the memory of the members. So we go back to our tradition that we remember, and I shall try to pick out of 2,000 years tradition some relevant issues that can help us for the resolution of the case. And first, I shall go to the Bible. And I shall give you what I call here, you see on the page, biblical perspectives. There you will see an absolute command coming from Jesus, but you will see also some kind of, shall I say, pastoral concern expressed in the Gospel of Matthew and also expressed in the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. There we see the seeds of a pattern. Throughout 2,000 years, the church did not cease to voice absolute command, at the same time try to find solution for difficult cases and try somehow to convey the mercy of God parallel with what was an absolute precept. Then, from the biblical perspectives, I shall move to a broader tradition. That is, I shall speak to you about the development of doctrine concerning marriage through 2,000 years in the Western Church. I shall touch somewhat on the Eastern Church too, because that's our sister church, as we say. And you will discover the same pattern there. On the one hand, there is an absoluteness. On the other hand, there is an ongoing, permanent attempt to exercise mercy for those who are in trouble, even more than that, those who, by any kind of severe judgment, are in a sinful situation. Then I turn to the contemporary law of the church and see what it tells us. And with that, I concluded my search in the tradition. Of course, I'm picking out relevant issues only and cannot give you an exhaustive explanation, and I will not do that. But I think all the relevant issues, in one way or another, will be mentioned. Then we look at what happens according to the hypothetical case that I indicated in the beginning with the second marriage. And what we find there is that, yes, of course, it cannot be a sacrament, but of course it is a sacred event. Sacred event, and what proves that is that there may well be, or there are, children from the second marriage. And in that second marriage, the most sacred activity of God and the parents have taken place, which is generating a new human being for eternal life. So we must take that into consideration. And so then I begin to work my way towards towards the resolution of the issue. I shall return to the absolute command of Jesus that must stand. We cannot play around with his words. On the other hand, I shall show you that right from the beginning, there was always in the mind of the church as to how to help those who are asking for mercy, no matter what they have done before. And then a kind of simple question comes up. Could the whole issue resolved by the church simply giving a dispensation from the first marriage and let the second marriage take place? And the answer will be, the church is not doing that. I shall say more about that. But watch my word, I did not say the church cannot do it. All I said is the church is not doing it. Certainly not the Western church. Certainly not for the second millennium. And that's an important point of reference. And then I shall mention a practice in the Eastern Orthodox Church. I am not going into details now, but you will say it's interesting. They too have Christian tradition, and if we know the whole tradition of Christianity, we absolutely need to go to them and ask how did they understood the gospel, how did they understood the development over so many centuries. In connection with that, I shall raise the question, what is a mysterious practice in the East that they call economy? It's some mysterious power in the church, as they would say, that helps us to resolve intractable, insoluble situations, kind of cutting through the difficulties. And finally, I just mentioned, you see it on the page, it sounds a bit strange perhaps, what is God's perspective in all these cases? And don't we know that God is love, and his prime concern as regards human being is to show his mercy. So can this mercy be extended to persons who are in second marriages, illegally contracted according to the law of the Catholic Church? I indicate also my resolution right from now. And frankly, I think it is a resolution that I would be not surprised if the Synod came pretty much to the same conclusion, which is that we can never expect a general legislation as from now on second marriages are good and valid, but what we can expect is the Church will transmit in its own unique way God's own concern for persons who are asking for his mercy and will grant it. But to arrive at this conclusion will take some time, and we will have to go through some, I hope, interesting arguments. Also, you may hear issues that no one told you before. But I think I can say truly that there cannot be many sources that in one way or another over so many years I have not consulted. So I try to give you a very fair and balanced overview of the Catholic mind beginning from the apostolic times to our own times. So this is a sort of summary, a map that you can keep in your mind, and we begin now to walk through the problem. Here it is. As you know, the Church is presently celebrating the Synod in Rome, and we hear a question raised among the people. May divorced and remarried persons receive Holy Communion? The question is not about some covered way of receiving communion, like the parish priest telling somebody, you know, it will be all right, just do not come to our church or they know you go to another church. No, we are not talking about that. We are talking about incorporating a person who, through the community, experiencing God's own mercy. Now, to bring the problem closer to you, let me approach it through a hypothetical case that I mentioned. And here are our friends, Nancy and Henry. Nancy and Henry, both Roman Catholics, marry according to their faith and according to the legal norms of the Church. Nothing is missing either in their intention or in the external observance of the law. And for a few years, all goes well. They are a happy household. They are blessed with children. Then, unexpectedly, tragedy strikes. Henry breaks his vow. Henry abandons Nancy and their children, and he marries another woman. A few years pass by, and nothing indicates that Henry ever wants to return to his first marriage. So Nancy, abandoned, broken-hearted. Once she was dreaming of a fullness of life as wife and mother, loving family. Now she's alone, and her children have no father. In this case, I assume the children remained with Nancy. As it happens, though, after a while, Nancy meets a good man. Let us call him James. And they like each other. And then love blossoms. They wish to marry. They consult church lawyers, and the lawyers are unanimous in their response. The annulment of the first marriage is out of question. They knew what they were doing and they did it. Nancy's marriage to Henry is alive, they would say. And it's alive until death do them part. Nancy hesitates. She's thinking of her children who are deprived of a father, and then attracted by the prospect of having a good man for spouse. But she feels guilty for breaking the law of the church if she marries. Then, after all, she marries James, according to civil law, an act that in canon law, in the law of the church, is irreparably null and void, period. But, as it happens, Nancy's union with James is successful by any kind of human measure. The new couple is blessed with children. And through it all, Nancy is joyful, joyful in the family. Nancy is sad whenever she goes to church. And she remains close to her parish community. She sees also that all her children, born from the second marriage, are educated in the Catholic faith. She is happy as a wife and mother because her dream and desire are fulfilled. She is sad as a Christian because she is not admitted to the table of the Lord. Now, the granting of the Eucharist to Nancy is an issue for her parish community as well, because she's known there and they like her. She's with them in so many good works. But she's not with them when they are nourished with the body and blood of Christ. So people are asking, where is God's mercy? To find a well-conceived answer to that question, we need to enter into some broader horizons than just compassion. With God, we need to gather information, namely in the scriptures, in the 2,000 years of tradition, and also in the presently valid legal norms of the Church. That's obvious. I'm not leaving out anything there. Now I'm taking you to the scriptures. Scriptural perspectives. You remember when the Pharisees raised with Jesus the question of fidelity. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? You find it in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus responds by asserting the duty of fidelity. Watch this. Jesus responds by asserting the duty of fidelity. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Yes, but the exchange between the Pharisees and Jesus was not in academic dialogue. The question was not about the essence of marriage in natural law. Is it indissoluble or not? No, this is not what the Pharisee was asking. He was not asking, what is the substance of the sacrament of marriage? Would not make any sense for him. It was about a moral duty concerning the obligation of the spouses. And what Jesus said is that neither of them has the right to break the bond, to dismiss the other. Each of them has the duty to be faithful to the other. That is, the Pharisee was asking a practical question, and Jesus gave a practical answer. Jesus added, however, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That is, Jesus reminded that every marriage covenant, there is a third party and a principal party, and the actor is the Creator. What is he telling the Pharisees? That it's not the parties that tied the bond. God put it together. God put them together. And therefore, it is God who has power, authority, jurisdiction over the covenant of marriage, over the covenant among the spouses. It is God who has power to bind and to loose concerning marriage. Problems, however, in interpreting Jesus' words must have arisen in the very early communities. Because if from Mark's gospel, which is conceivably the earliest gospel we have, we turn to Matthew's gospel, which was written later, Matthew speaks about trouble. He reports that the seemingly absolute precept needs a qualification, and he adds, except in the case of, and what you will find in the ordinary translation, either adultery or something like unchastity. So, what you have there is an absolute command. At the same time, in the Word of God, in Matthew's Gospel, there is an exception. And this exception, actually, no one exactly knows what it meant fully. It's certainly an exception. And the Greek church translated it always as adultery. Some English translation speaks about unchastity. And it could comprehend some kind of sexual misbehavior, and that's probably the best understanding one you can come to. But what is interesting now, that this trend emerging, this is the first trace we find of it, in absolute command, and at the same time, a concern for those who are in difficulties. And then we go further in the Bible, to the writings of St. Paul. And Paul encountered a problem in the Church of Corinth. How to handle a situation, one, in a marriage entered by two unbelievers, pagans as we say it. Two pagans are married. And then one of them becomes a believer, receives baptism. And then the unbeliever turns against the other and destroys the peace of the household. So we are not talking now about adultery, unchastity, but destroys the peace of the household. And then Paul, you can feel some hesitation from his part. He says, well, the Lord had no instructions for that. He left no instructions for that. Therefore, I, not the Lord, say that. The right of believing partner to have peace, it is of higher value than the marriage itself. Therefore, if the unbeliever wants to break the bond and leave the other, so be it. You have been called to peace. Peace that faith, hope, and love gives you is more important than your marriage. Now notice, we are talking about a marriage that eventually became a marriage between a Christian and a non-Christian. We are not talking as yet about a marriage that is between two Christians. But be that as it may, this is what Paul says, Word of God. Be that as it may, to this day, the ruling of Paul remains a norm for the Roman Catholic Church. And we abide by it. And we do have cases with some regularity where this is applied, and a dispensation is granted when marriage is between a Christian and a non-Christian, between a baptized and a non-baptized person. These are all small elements that I am steadily gathering so that we could come at the end to some resolution. So the Church has accepted Paul's practical wisdom, and to this day, in similar circumstances, the Church honors the believer's right to peace over the duty of keeping a troublesome spouse. But even after such concession to human piety, the scriptures leave no doubt that the early church believed that God had the highest esteem for Christian marriage, and Paul is the witness for that. A Christian marriage is a mystery, he says, and a profound one, and it refers to the relationship between Christ and the church. That is what Paul is saying, that a marriage between two Christians is a symbol for, call it, the marriage of Christ to his own church. So what can we take away from the Bible? First of all, there is an absolute duty not to break the bond. Second, that when difficulties emerged, the church, and here Matthew the evangelist, Paul the apostles, was searching for a pastoral accommodation. Now, I go to history, broader history, development of doctrine and practice over 2,000 years. In the Middle Ages, as marriage gradually became recognized as one of the seven sacraments, ecclesiastical authorities were compelled more and more to arbitrate about the validity of a bond. Difficulties arose in marriages. They had to clarify the question, what makes a marriage? So we are talking about the 10th century now. In general, that's when this came to a peak. Many marriage cases came to bishops and came to the Pope, and there were disputes whether the marriage was valid or invalid and so forth. And this question could not be answered unless first you clarify the issue, what makes marriage? Well then, as I mentioned to you, we are somewhere 10th century, but nonetheless, of course, they returned to tradition. And they found in the writings of St. John Chrysostom from the 4th century a statement that became standard. And it is that consent creates the marriage, not consummation. I repeat, marriage is created by consent, not by the consummation of marriage. This has been confirmed by various popes. In the 12th century, that's the most formal and very authoritative confirmation by Pope Alexander III. And ever since, the Church held that consent is that makes marriage. What does it mean? It means that when you see people going into the church, celebrate the wedding, as soon as they pronounced their promises, the sacrament is completed, and they are fully married. The consummation as such does not add anything to the validity of marriage, but it comes something else. This Pope Alexander I mentioned, and who formalized this doctrine in the 12th century, declared at the same time that the church had the power to dissolve true, valid sacraments of marriage if they were not consummated. Now, you can see here a shift. We are not talking about the indissolubility of the sacrament. He, the Pope himself, says that the sacrament can be dissolved provided the marriage was not consummated. And we have such cases nowadays also before ecclesiastical courts. But then the same Pope affirmed that as a matter of fact, when consummation has taken place, then the church will not dispense, period. Call it a practical decision, but that is the practice of the Western Church, and that has been certainly for the last 1,000 years, and possibly before that we do not have all that much documentation. But that tells you something interesting. Just a little while ago I told you that God has authority, power, and jurisdiction over marriage. And yet the church is dissolving the sacrament in the case of a non-consummated marriage. It means the church is using a divine authority to do that, and therefore can do it. At the same time, the church has taken, if you like, I like to call it a sort of divine prudence. Once the marriage is consummated, there will be no dispensation. And this is, practically speaking, what we refer to when we today speak about the indissolubility of marriage. Indissolubility means that once the consummation has taken place, the church will not grant dispensation. All right, and this, you can see again some practical accommodation. An absolute attitude and very rigid. At the same time, yes, you know, there are marriages for one reason or another, they were not, they could not be consummated. Sometimes, for instance, it happened that one of the spouses after the wedding, but before the consummation, declared that he wanted to be a monk, or she wanted to be a nun. And the Pope said, that's all right, I can dispense you from the sacrament, provided there was no consummation. If there was consummation, you had made your choice, and there you stay. But there was another element that we must take into consideration, and it's this. The Eastern Church, I already mentioned, developed a different practice. We are talking about the Orthodox Church. And the practice was that they took the words of Matthew, which is that man should not dismiss his wife, except in the case of adultery, unchastity, as a permission to let people proceed to a second marriage or sometimes a third marriage because of this divine dispensation. So they accepted fully that there was a divine precept that you had to believe with an act of faith, that the spouses cannot break the bond. They figured that there was also a divine permission that when adultery has taken place from, by one spouse or the other, then the marriage can be dissolved, sort of. They did not quite use that word, but certainly a second marriage could be celebrated, which was kind of not so joyous, and the liturgy was very different. It was a little bit like a penitential service. Lord, you know human frailty, and therefore would you bless this, this second couplet no matter what happened. Something like that. So we come to this is just an introduction to what I'm going to say right now. We come to the 16th century. In the 16th century, there was the Council of Trent, very important council in the history of the church. And a proposal was put before the bishops to declare plain and simple that marriage was indissoluble. But then some bishops raised questions. Are we going to condemn the Orthodox Church? Because for them it's not indissoluble. And indeed, they use an argument from the scripture. But on the other hand, the Western tradition was to regard marriage as indissoluble. If we proclaim that as an article of faith, from that moment on, the whole Orthodox Church should be considered as heretics. Do you really want to do that? And the council responded by saying, no, we do not want to do that. But then what do you want to do? And they went around the problem, literally around the problem, by a very clever device. The proposition to state simply and plainly that marriage is indissoluble was revoked. And then a new proposition was put before the council, and it sounded something like this. If anybody said that the Roman Catholic Church is acting against the gospel when it preaches and practices the indissolubility of marriage, be condemned. Now, the Greeks never said that. They did what they wanted, but they never said it. And the result was this somewhat ambivalent definition of the Council of Trent. The Greeks were not condemned. They are not heretics because they admit second or even third marriages. But nonetheless, when we defend it, then we are not doing anything against the gospel either. And in some way you could say the answer of the Greeks was, well, it's good for you. I never blame you for it. Therefore, the Latins, the Westerners, answered, and we do not condemn you. And this state of the things remained to this very day. How did the Greeks handle that? Well, you have in their tradition various type of explanations, but they refer to a mysterious gift given by Christ to his church. Their argument is that Christ has given a divine authority to the church. And this divine authority extends even over the bond. And when someone, in one way or another, and it could be through sinful acts, ended up with an intractable situation, like Nancy did, for which there is no human solution because no matter what you do, you will hurt some people. Then, the bishop, who is the successor of the apostles with divine authority, can intervene, and with that authority, as if it were cut through the complication, and say, God mercy be with you. You repent for the wrong that you may have done, And at the same time, in the name of Christ, we give you forgiveness. And such practice continues in the Orthodox Church. And the name they use for it, economy, but divine economy, you can think of that, divine disposition, divine arrangement. And to this day, on this point, no Roman Catholic could, should, must ever call them heretics. They belong to us, and we belong to them. We are both a part of the Church of Christ, even if otherwise, and for other reasons, we are not united. So much for the tradition. That's pretty much what we are today. That is, we are today, but in order to tell you more what we are today, I want to tell you about the present situation of canon law or the present approach of the Church in a legal way to the issue of marriage. Now, in the present Code of Canon Law, there are two rules directly relevant for our problems. One, Canon 1141, announces the principle concerning marriage. And listen to that. It's carefully articulated. A marriage lawfully contracted cannot be dissolved by any human power or by any cause other than death. Now, often this canon is interpreted as stating the absolute indissolubility of all marriages, but we already know that such interpretation is incorrect, because the Church indeed does dissolve sacramental marriage if it is not consummated. So the canon is applicable to some marriages, but not to all marriages. Far from it. We know from past history and present practice that the Church did and does dissolve sacramental non-consummated marriages. And also the Church dissolves valid but not sacramental marriage, which would be between a baptized and a non-baptized person. And the canon speaks about no human power. Marriage lawfully contracted cannot be dissolved by any human power. But the question is, could it be dissolved by divine power? After all, the Church has divine power, and this divine power is exercised every time when you receive absolution from your sins, because no one but God can forgive sins. So we know from history and practice that the Church does dissolve sacramental bond if the marriage is not consummated. The rule of indissolubility, therefore, applies only and exclusively to consummated sacramental marriages. But remember then what I mentioned, that as a matter of practice, the Church will not give, for 1,000 years now, certainly and considerably before, but our documentation is very states, from sacramental and consummated marriages. Now, here a question emerges. Is it conceivable that the consummation itself would take away a divine power from the Church to dissolve the bond? That doesn't make good sense. Or it's more likely that the Church retains the divine power and could dispense, has divine authority from the bond, but for the sake of the common good, to uphold the stability of marriages, the Church grants no such dispensation. In other terms, the practice of the better Church to uphold indissolubility is the fruit of a prudential pastoral judgment on the part of the Church. And the Church is entitled to do that. We are used to talk about, say, infallibility and infallibility of the Church in doctrinal matters, but at the same time there is such thing as, you could call it, indefectibility of the Church in matters of prudence. And you can see the problem if the church simply declared today that marriage could be dissolved. The last defender of Christian marriages would collapse. And the impact would be enormous, not just within the Roman Catholic Church, but also beyond the Roman Catholic Church. But what we cannot say today is that anybody who would claim that the church has defined indissolubly, church defined infallibly that marriage is indissoluble, if anybody press the idea this is an infallible definition and you could put it into the creed, he's exaggerating. As you see, the issue is pretty complex and not easy. But in this complexity, our question is, through this maze, can we find, as it were, an entry for divine mercy for persons who are in the position of Nancy? That's what we are asking. Without denying what is absolute, without denying the church has a right to be, as it were, divinely prudent, but nonetheless, we have persons of contrite heart, even if they sinned. Can we invoke divine mercy? And that's what I'm going to speak of now. For the moment, let me sum up the belief and practice of the Church. By divine command, the spouses have the duty to remain faithful to each other until death do them part. They do not have the power to dissolve the marriage. The sacrament, that is the matrimonial contract, cannot be dissolved by any human power. The sacrament, matrimonial contract, can be dissolved by divine power in the Church. It remains a disputed question whether or not the Church has the power to dissolve a sacramental and consummated marriage. In the history of the Western Church, we find a dialectical development throughout history. You can see that. On the one side, the Church keeps affirming that marriage is a sacramental bond that no human being may break. On the other hand, the Church steadily tries to come to the help of distressed persons. That's the image that we have. That's the image that we have to work with. Now, let us return to the case of Nancy. To the second marriage, the second marriage of Nancy is an event in new creation. May sound unusual, but that's it. She was at fault in the beginning. But her reprehensible act, breaking the law of the Church, has led to new creation. You remember that introduction into Eastern Vigil? O lucky fault of Adam, who brought us such a Redeemer. Could that be applied to the fault of Nancy? God cooperated and gave them children, destined to eternal life. So he somehow accepted them. The natural marital relationship, natural, but faulty by church law, between Nancy and James brought personal blessings to them. It is a miraculous event, marked by God's graceful mercy. So, a question for the church should be how to honor and how to support the new God-given reality, and that's the second marriage between Nancy and James. It's not a sacrament, but because of new creation of human beings, it's a sacred situation. Creation itself is sacred, but when immortal human beings are brought into existence, that's a sacred action and cannot be done without God, and God is cooperating there. Contemplating the miracle of such an event, marked by God's graceful intervention, the first question for the church at the situation should be how to support the new God-given reality. I'm not saying recognition of the marriage, but it's a God-given reality. It is there. We cannot run away from it. A new reality that consists of human beings and upheld by a net of complex relations of rights and duties. No doubt, the church should recognize, support, and promote the new family. You cannot abandon them. It should promote the Catholic education of those children, and Nancy is there to cooperate. It should promote the union between Nancy and James, if for no other reason, for the sake of the children. The children did not ask to come into this world, but they are born with human and divine rights. They have a right, as it were, to the loving care of their parents. That's where we are. And you understand immediately, if you consider this, and frankly, I do not see that mentioned in the literature, but you can see that this is a situation that needs consideration, and also a situation that calls for the help of the church. It cannot be swept aside by saying this is an invalid marriage, no good, and you, Nancy, do not come to communion, and otherwise we are not interested. The church is mandated to deal with this new situation. Yes, people may have been at fault, but now Nancy would like to do what she can, but what can she do? A couple of traditionally imposed solutions appear as no resolution. They do harm the new creation. Nancy's second family. One advice is that Nancy should abandon the household. But surely, where will she go? The first marriage is gone. There is no question that she cannot go back there. And the children have a right to be educated by their mother and their father, and as one couple that lives in harmony with each other. And this is a right that God has given to the children. He created them with this right. So Nancy is entangled, imprisoned, in an intractable net of demands that human frailty has created, with no apparent exit. The only exit that the church could give to Nancy is you wait until James dies. Doesn't sound in harmony. Doesn't sound in harmony with God's mercy. Anyway, no one has described this situation better than, at one time, Professor Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Benedict XVI. in an article published in 1972. In a second marriage, moral obligations have arisen towards the children, toward the family, toward the second spouse, and no similar obligation from the first marriage exists. Because regarding the first marriage, nothing can be done. Therefore, you cannot speak about an obligation that you cannot fulfill. To give up the second marriage, listen to that, to give up the second marriage is not appropriate on moral grounds. And continence does not appear as a real possibility in the practical order. It is something for persons of great virtue, writes Professor Ratzinger, not for ordinary people. And indeed, Professor Ratzinger, in a discreet way, warns church authorities that to tell Nancy to walk out of her second marriage would be equivalent to compel her to do or to commit an immoral act. She would abandon a family that she helped to create, a family that is a source of life for the church and for the civic community. She would then make James and their children victims. Further, Ratzinger thinks that the counsel to Nancy and to James further, Ratzinger thinks that the counsel to Nancy and to James to continue with their common life in the same household, in everything except what concerns normal sexual life, is an excessive imposition. Such advice is usually given in guise of, you should live as brother and sister, but you see, you cannot build a family life on false foundations. And this is simply false foundation. You could even say it is a lie and it will not work. Therefore, can the church accept this second situation and tell Nancy that you may continue in your second marriage and at the same time return to Eucharistic communion? Well, time is going, and I shall do a little bit of summing up now. And if you return to the page that I distributed, it might be easier to follow what I'm going to do. We are going towards a resolution, and I think a resolution can be found. First of all, the absolute command of Jesus stands. The duty of fidelity. No spouse has the power, the authority, the right to break the bond. What God has joined together, no man put asunder. On the other hand, God asserts his fidelity in the sense of not only taking care of the persons, but also taking care of the second family. So, can the church simply grant dispensation from the first marriage? Well, what you can say from theological sources, the church probably has such power and authority, but you must act immediately that for prudential reasons the Western Church never uses it. And there are very good arguments to say that to proclaim that the Church, as it were, will be dispensing divorces from now on, would be a catastrophic impact on families, not only Christian families, but families throughout the world. There's no doubt about that. But on the other hand, we have these exceptional cases. And you see, I think some light would come also from Vatican Council II. Again, it would be rather complicated to go into details there, but at Vatican Council II, in the Declaration for Religious Freedom, that's the title of the document, there is one important principle which goes well beyond the Declaration of Religious Freedom, which is that there are situations when you respect the conscience of a person and you give priority to the person over a proposition, even if it's a doctrinal proposition. That's why we can recognize other religions as our partners and equal partners in the civic society, because we respect every person there, even if we believe something different. Now there you have something like an indication, something like an arrow indicating a direction. Nancy is a person. Nancy is in need of God's mercy. And then, can we use this traditional idea of economy that developed in the Eastern Church? They are part of the Church of Christ, and we are part of the Church of Christ. And therefore, can we say, as some of the Eastern churches say, that when human beings, out of their limited intelligence, out of their limited freedom, created a situation for which there is no human solution, somehow the redeeming force of God, through an act of the bishop, they insist on that, but it's the redeeming act of God, can enter into the situation and resolve it in such a way that our man-made laws made with Jan Epple, could not do. We just got entangled ourselves in the web and we cannot get out of it. But I add still here, and you may like to think about that. I think there is an impatience in God himself when it comes to the exercising of his mercy. And when there is Nancy, who is of contrite heart, regrets the mistake, if it was a mistake, her second marriage she made, and now wants to return to Holy Communion or to the Eucharistic community, but she cannot. God himself becomes impatient. Just think of the immense patience of God. When, for instance, I give you some examples how God deals with so-called sinners. You remember when Jesus, met the Samaritan woman by the well? Now that woman, you remember Jesus asked him, what about your husband? And then she said, I don't have a husband. And Jesus answered, yes, because you had 5, and now you have another one. Then immediately, without asking for conversion, he sends her to announce the good news to the Samaritans. Now, if that woman at that point was not in the state of grace, I do not know who was. Something similar with the adulterous woman. She is there, contrite, accused, was in danger of death, and Jesus cuts through all the problems. The one of you who never sinned should throw the first stone. And then Jesus turned to the woman, no one stoned you. Go in peace and sin no more. I wish I could have that absolution for all my wrongs, in the sense that's absolute, it's forgiven. Now, can there be a Christian instinct? This is the question that should be put to Christian communities like you are. And anyway, I'm putting you this question. In one way, after all these complications, and I wanted to show you the complications, still, looking at the situation of Nancy, contrite of heart, working with the parish, wants to come to Eucharist, and then she's told by authorities, okay, you can do everything. You can come to the parish, you can help with sorting out envelopes, and of course, if you have a donation, it's most well received. Nonetheless, no Eucharist. You see, something doesn't fit. And also, they tell Nancy, okay, you go back to your second husband, and then, yes, you live as husband and wife, but remember, no sex. A tension is bound to develop that rebounds on the children and against the right of the children to have a harmonious education. So these are serious matters. Now, what I'm saying here, that the Christian community, what I'm saying here, that in the Christian community, there is a sense of faith, a sense of divine attitudes. And Vatican Council II recognizes that in the dogmatic constitution on the Church, Lumen Gentium, and names it supernatural sense of faith. In the Christian community, there is also a sense what divine mercy is. And I think after everything is honestly explained, this is what we have. This is what we can show you through handling concepts and propositions and decrees and decisions. And then Nancy's contrite there. Could she be taken back? If the answer is yes, it certainly does not mean that tomorrow the Church proclaims a new law, that all those who are divorced and remarried are permitted to come to the Eucharist. That is no general law. I cannot see the Church ever will do that. But on the other hand, I can see that either the bishop or the parish priest, after listening to the whole story, after sees what is happening, acts pretty much in the same way, as somehow maybe in your heart you feel Jesus would have acted. Nancy, go in peace. And I shall see you on Sunday when you receive communion. Amen. Yes.
What happens in your conclusion if there are no children ever? For
Well,
whatever
as
reason?
I mentioned, this is a hypothetical
Right.
case, a typical case. And then you consider everything that is on its own merits, and the case could be, the solution could be applied even if they have no children,
Okay.
or they have children, that's obvious. Yes.
Okay, in your case too, it is with the bishop's permission that Nancy then can receive communion. What about the priority of her conscience? And she feels that
Well,
she's not
conscience,
really
you
doing
see,
wrong.
yeah.
Can she still, without the bishop's permission?
Yeah. Conscience is something, we would need another lecture. I'm like a traffic jam in my mind. Regarding conscience, you have to take into account two things. Conscience primarily refers to integrity of the person, does not refer primarily to the right judgment of the person. Therefore, in conscience, I can hold that the earth is flat and everybody must respect my human dignity, even if I hold that. But on the other hand, everybody else is perfectly entitled to make sure that I'm not making a mistake in my judgment. You see, that those are two different things. So my answer is that because the readmission to Eucharist is an act in the community needs to look at the case, and that can be done best, discreetly, wisely, through a designated person. And the bishop is the one who is in official position to do that, or I would have no problem with the parish priest. And also, one sign of genuine contrition would be if the person really wants somebody else to look at it. I'm not deceiving myself. That's always when somebody appeals to his conscience. Watch out if the person opens his conscience for examination. That's the well-meaning person. Yes, I see lots. Yes, lady.
Is the indissolubility of marriage considered infallible?
Yes, see.
Is the indissolubility of a marriage considered an infallible teaching?
Well, that's what I was trying to explain. It's infallible teaching is a very complex concept. What you have is, I can read you word by word, I hear, nothing is infallible unless manifestly can be proved. That's word by word a canon law. You never assume that something is infallible unless you can prove it. That's the burden of proof is on the person who asserts that something is infallible. Now, then you go back to various documents, and what we find is obviously the indissolubility of the sacrament cannot be infallible because the church is dissolving it all the time. I mean, you go to Arlington Chancery or Washington Chancery, they will have probably one or two cases of non-consummation and asking for dispensation. Therefore, those marriages can be dissolved. But what we know is that once consummation has taken place, then the church does not give dispensation. Now, is this a prudential judgment or is it declaration in an infallible way? Theologians are disputing about that. But we should be very careful if we push too much that indissolubility of marriage is an absolute article of faith. That is, you could say, I believe in Almighty God and the indissolubility of marriage. You are, by the same words, declaring the whole Orthodox Church heretical. So you must be very careful about that. Yes.
Based on what you were saying, I can see how you would say you don't expect there to be some widespread blanket
I think we
rule.
should come closer to each other.
I'm sorry. Given what you said, I can see why you would not expect a blanket ruling to
Yes.
say people who have been divorced and remarried can take communion. But I'm thinking from a pastoral point of view, even though it makes sense for this to be handled on a one-on-one basis with clergy, how do you, anticipating this might be the case, more widespread, how would you deal with the kind of political issues that come up? That people will think of this as, a John politician, gets to have an annulment and remain in the Catholic Church, whereas someone else does not. How pastorally will the church handle the inevitable politics, even if the morality and the ethical approach by doing it on an individual basis is the way to go?
I do not think it would make major difficulty, because it would be, these cases I'm talking about are really exceptional. You see, the person is of contrite heart and they want to come back. Now, your question is very interesting, and actually it is Ratzinger who worked out the whole procedure for that. And his idea is that when somebody wants to come back, then it's not enough to prepare the person for that, but you have to prepare the parish. And also, it should be step by step, like somebody wants to come back, was at fault, but wants to come back, contrite of heart, then enter into parish life step by step, and indeed first participating in the external works of the parish for some time, the charitable works of the parish, and then look into the circumstances. If there are children, are they educated in the right way, and so forth. So it would be a process, not one single act.
So in terms of the education of the parish, and also in terms of communication, media, and so on, to explain these things, because without that, I think that the temptation would be to say,
Well,
this is pick and
you
choose.
know, to take my position, you must have a judgment when to give an interview and when not to give an interview.
It's not that, it's that I think the teaching power of that moment will be lost, and
If we
greater
t-
harm done
Yeah.
without that. So I think your point about putting the act within the context of a parish is.
It should be done wisely, I could not agree more. But I think it can be done discreetly. And the other thing is, we should not begin by asking what the media will do. We should try to do the right things and then see how we handle the media, but we should handle them rightly.
I only
Like
say
now,
that, I only say that about the media because that's the modern method of communication,
Yes.
and it's based not having been in the media. I wouldn't wrap them. I feel it's more a case of what the populace will say that then gets transmitted, and so the idea of catechesis in the parish and more beyond that, in terms of communication of those ideas broadly, I think is a way in which not only can people in trying situations of a second marriage, but also perhaps help those in a troubled first marriage understand more about their rights and obligations in marriage. So I think it's a wider conversation that I'm
Yeah.
saying. I mentioned the media
Yeah.
only to say that wider conversation
Yeah.
in wherever it goes.
Yeah, you are right. In my exposition, I left out the problem of the first marriage. In fact, what you have in the manuscript that did not read out, I put something there that, and then the first husband, Henry, emigrated into Antarctica and never came back. So to avoid that, but you are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. You know, the church should look into that situation if one is in Arlington, the other one is in Washington D.C. But much of it that should be left to the local people. Yes.
Father, in your hypothetical case, you say that that Nancy has to be contrite before she could be welcomed back. It seems to me that...
No, I think we must come closer.
Oh.
Or we must-
In your case that you gave, hypothetical case, you
Yes.
said that Nancy must be contrite.
Yes.
And I think there's really some question about contriteness here, because she wanted the first marriage to continue, and the person left her, and then she's left. She then makes a choice, and she wouldn't have had to make that choice if the first husband had stayed with her, to remarry. So I think to say, from my view, that Nancy has to be contrite puts a big burden on Nancy.
Yes, I have no problem with what you are saying. I use that because no matter what, there was a breach of law.
Mhm.
So, because that happened publicly, therefore, the church would expect something, some sign that this was not in order to be contemptuous for the law of the church and so forth. That's basically what I am saying. That is, when Nancy married, there was a breach of law, and somehow that has to be balanced out by some kind of declaration.
I just don't think the burden should be on the person who was left, and that's
Put
how
it in the
it's
other
sounded.
way, and I think we shall see it more clearly. If somebody comes and says, I'm not contrite,
Mhm.
and I think should not have followed your law, you put off immediately those who want to receive you.
Mhm.
And the good Christian is contrite all the time.
You have great faith.
We don't. And never enough. It's a gentle expression. That's why.
Okay, thank you.
Did I see some? Yes.
Father, you talk about, the abuse, the dissolution of the special cases coming from violation
of the sexual part of marriage. But what about, and not so much then, but maybe now, the physical abuse of perhaps a woman by a spouse?
Well, I think Matthew would have agreed to that. But there we have a problem for anybody here who knows Greek. The Greek word is used by Matthew, which is porneia. Now, at once I collected the interpretation of porneia. You know how to, I found over 50. But most obvious is some kind of sexual misbehavior. That's the most obvious. Because that must have been the problem in that community. Otherwise, Matthew would have brought it up. And for Paul it was colony. Imagine, you know, the non-Christian harassing the other one about her good God or something. So they dealt with practical cases, and we see the kind of the traces of this practical problem in the Gospels. Yes.
Now a difficult question.
No. In the period since the council, the last 50 years or so, within your professional community, the academic community of canon lawyers, have there been a small number of diverging paths that people have tried to develop? You know, we were in the middle 1960s, and now suddenly we've got the Synod. There's a gap in there. Has there been any activity to try to develop these lines of thought in that period that you could sketch?
I think I can honestly answer yes. I'm not sure they are in majority. But I can honestly answer yes, there has been, and I could name quite a number of them, who are honestly looking for a solution. You see, what is happening here, in the beginning I told you about Cardinal Müller and Cardinal Gasper. What is happening here, one reads the law, all the law, and nothing but the law. The other one goes beyond it to history, but even when you have history, I think there is much more in the church as the living sense of the faithful. And that's very difficult to pinpoint. And of course, you always can find people who are on your side or against you. But we have become, and no lesser person than the Pope is saying that, not quite explicitly, but hinting at it, we became too legalized. Now, think of that. Whatever we have in the church, in the beginning, it had its roots in the good sense of people. There was no code of canon law. There were not even gospels written down. There was no instruction. And yet they developed an organized church. They developed a set of rules, eventually turned into a gate code. And it was a creative Christian instinct in the mind and heart of people who did that. But what happened is, it reached a certain point where this has been put down in writing, and then these writings became like laws carved in a stone. And instinctively today, we run to what is the law, what is the rule. We are a bit too legalized. Now we need laws because we need order. It's a question of balance, sound balance. And we would need much more of this instinct of the faithful. And in fact, what you would need, this kind of thing we are doing here. Discussing an issue, you hear me, I have nothing better to do, so I can fish out all the information that you need for or against, and then you give your opinion, you think about it, you pray about it, and then eventually we return again and see if we can put into some nice shape and form. We need more of that. That can go wild too, there is no doubt about it, but ultimately, we must trust the good sense of people and also the Christian sense of those who believe. So anything else? One more.
Yeah. What is my role and responsibility as an individual member of this community aware of what, an irregular situation in which a person is receiving communion, though in a second marriage? What am I supposed to do?
Well,
Anything?
At the moment, nothing gets you information-wise. You probably cannot do more than that, taking the information. But when it comes to what is my personal law, is the person himself who can determine it. Now, obviously, there are many families who are affected by these problems in one way or another. They can discuss it.
May I suggest that you back up so that the camera isn't taking the back of your head?
Oh, I'm so sorry for that. Oh, I did not even realize that.
Yep.
I'm so
Give him a
precious.
few feet.
So it will be the individual who can make the best judgment about
Yeah,
that.
okay.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, well, thank you for your attention.